She was quietly wrapping jewelry and writing handmade cards with unnerving precision. This careful preparation was absolutely not for an upcoming lavish society gala. She was orchestrating the precise details of her very own funeral. The sun poured into the massive bedroom overlooking a bustling Fifth Avenue. Babe Paley was 62 years old and physically wasting away, yet she remained dressed in flawless silk. Her impossibly thin hands, mapped with blue veins, methodically folded each heavy Cartier diamond ring and strand of pearls into delicate tissue paper. She held a fountain pen steadily, scripting each name tag with perfect, unshakable penmanship. To understand why a woman who once seemed to hold the room around her still ended in isolation, we have to turn back the clock. We have to return to the place where her perfection was first programmed. Long before modern media systems shaped beauty, one woman helped define how public desire looked. Consider a seemingly effortless, fleeting moment. She casually untied a vibrant silk scarf and loosely fastened it to the handle of an expensive handbag. Soon after, women across the country began copying the gesture. On her wrist, she paired a large Cartier diamond ring with a cheap plastic bangle purchased from a corner drugstore. The jarring plastic clicked defiantly against the precious gems, creating a visual contradiction that society widely interpreted as undeniable sartorial genius. She appeared on the prestigious International Best Dressed list 14 separate times throughout her life. When she let her hair turn naturally gray, many women noticed and followed. The core tragedy resided precisely in this intense public fixation. The public copied her immaculate style. Almost no one saw the psychological cost required to sustain it. She was systematically stripped of her humanity by an adoring society. Style was only the visible layer. Beneath it sat discipline, calculation, and the fear of losing control for even a second. She was framed as a flawless figure, made for admiration. In that role, there was no room for difficult or human emotion. She became a polished public image, one that slowly displaced the woman underneath. Every public appearance demanded constant, unwavering perfection at all times. She never disappointed the eager audience watching her every single move. But the most brutal lesson regarding physical beauty did not come from red-carpeted drawing rooms, but from a terrifying collision on a dark stretch of asphalt. In 1934, the deafening screech of crushing metal violently tore through the night air. The brutal reflection in the cold hospital mirror revealed a devastating aftermath. The young woman's front teeth were entirely shattered. Deep, ugly bruises covered her prominent cheekbones, and bleeding scars violently disrupted her formerly flawless complexion. The harsh, sterile lights of the operating theater beamed directly down as the surgical blade began its meticulous work, reshaping and rebuilding her shattered features. That catastrophic car accident abruptly stripped away her natural, innocent beauty. However, the subsequent medical intervention granted her an entirely new and far more formidable power. Some people later said the reconstructive surgery made her even more striking. Her cheekbones were reportedly reshaped to be much sharper and strikingly angular, rendering her face distinctly photogenic and almost hauntingly cinematic. When she finally awoke and the heavy bandages were removed, she recognized a cold, indisputable truth. She understood that beauty was not fixed. It could be altered, repaired, and managed. Beauty was a supremely malleable, artificial material. The surgeon's knife proved that human aesthetics could be scientifically reconstructed. She understood then that her face was a tangible asset, a canvas that required unwavering precision to maintain. This revelation fundamentally altered her perspective on her own physical identity forever. She was no longer merely a pretty girl from a good family. She had become someone who knew how to command a room and understood what that required. The physical trauma birthed a psychological resolve that would dictate the rest of her life. She realized that maintaining this new, striking facade would demand relentless, grueling effort. The darkness of the recovery room taught her something that fashion magazines would never dare to print. Her cold, entirely unwavering eyes stared intensely at the newly fitted false teeth resting in her mouth. Her knuckles turned stark white as she clenched her hands tightly together, fiercely forcing herself not to wince or display any weakness while her deep facial wounds were still healing. She finally understood that because her beauty was essentially a constructed material, it could easily be broken and repaired. More importantly, she realized beauty could be controlled. It could also be used as a social weapon. The widely celebrated perfection of Babe Paley's public life was never a serene, naturally occurring phenomenon. It was a massive, complex architectural structure that required constant, grueling maintenance. That facade was sustained through endurance, discipline, and the suppression of anything messy or human. She rigorously trained herself to never permit a single moment of visible ugliness again. The transformation was unyielding, and she accepted that early. She learned to project an aura of effortless grace while secretly managing the intense physical discomfort underneath. She mastered the precise art of visual manipulation through profound personal pain. But to transform that sharpened weapon into tangible, lasting power, she required a calculated blueprint designed by the most formidable woman she had ever known. And that specific architectural blueprint had been drafted long ago, entirely within the suffocating walls of the Boston elite, where romantic love was wholly irrelevant and strict calculation ruled everything. Boston is fundamentally not a city that tolerates weakness or idle romanticism. It is a strict, heavily guarded territory where old money families meticulously calculate the trajectory of their bloodlines across generations. Consider the cold, razor-sharp, and endlessly assessing eyes of Kate Cushing as she methodically analyzed her 3 young daughters' sitting posture. Imagine her intensely scrutinizing the precise angle at which they held their delicate porcelain teacups during afternoon gatherings. Looming heavily behind them was the massive, intimidating shadow of their father, Harvey Cushing. He was not merely a successful doctor, but a globally renowned Pulitzer Prize-winning neurosurgeon whose reputation demanded absolute perfection. Babe certainly was not born with an innate, genetic ability to ruthlessly calculate her social trajectory. She was systematically forged inside a highly pressurized psychological crucible. Kate Cushing absolutely did not raise her 3 daughters to pursue cheap romantic love or personal fulfillment. She aggressively molded them into elite diplomatic warriors. Her absolute, uncompromising objective for her children was singular and clear. They must marry up into ultimate power. Her older sisters married into the Astor, Roosevelt, and Whitney worlds, reinforcing the lesson the family had already taught. From a very young age, Babe absorbed a brutal, unyielding doctrine regarding her own inherent worth. She learned that a woman's value did not reside in her individual character or personal dreams. Her true, quantifiable worth was entirely determined by the specific mansion keys she held firmly in her hand after her wedding day. Before she could successfully hunt her largest, most elusive prey, she first needed to fluently speak the unspoken language that the highest echelons of power utilized to communicate. Look closely at her meticulously organized desk inside the bustling, highly competitive Vogue editorial office. It was heavily cluttered with freshly printed magazine galley proofs, waiting for her final, uncompromising approval. Babe's eyes were cold and decisive as she crossed out a fashion photograph. A slight problem in the lighting or the dress choice was enough for her to reject it. Accepting a demanding position as a fashion editor at Vogue was never about earning a basic living wage to support herself financially. The esteemed magazine essentially served as her advanced, highly exclusive university for mastering the subtle, intricate mechanics of soft power and social manipulation. That prestigious job aggressively taught her the precise, underlying grammar of public desire. It also trained her to think in sequence. Who entered first? Who sat near power? And which detail people would remember after the room emptied. She learned exactly how to visually arrange a large room so it immediately radiated an overwhelming, inescapable sense of silent authority. She learned precisely how a woman must walk, stand, and appear in order to instantly control the entire physical space the exact moment the heavy wooden door opened. She consciously learned to transform personal style into a highly effective, unspoken political language. The young editor systematically trained her sharp eyes to observe influential people as strategic, movable, decorative objects. She knew exactly where to place specific powerful individuals at a formal dinner table to silently maximize her own social leverage and secure vital alliances. She was absolutely not a naive, impressionable debutante waiting passively to be rescued by fate. She was becoming a careful social strategist, and she knew the stakes were high. She diligently applied those sophisticated, hard-earned lessons to her very first high-profile marriage. On official paper, the union appeared to be a flawless masterpiece of social engineering. The black and white wedding photograph captured an image of aristocratic perfection. On paper, the match looked flawless, which made the silence inside it even harder to ignore. Yet, a tight, forced, and frozen smile masked her beautiful face as she desperately tried to conceal the suffocating, deadly silence echoing inside their expansive Long Island home. Marrying Mortimer, a prominent oil heir and a highly decorated military veteran, was an exact, perfectly executed strategic move according to her mother's strict, unforgiving metrics. They possess the absolutely correct address and the flawlessly correct historical lineage. However, Babe quickly confronted the terrifying brutality of this rigid, calculating system. A perfect match constructed entirely on paper did not magically generate a functioning, emotionally resonant marriage. The profound internal emptiness and a total lack of genuine spiritual connection ultimately resulted in their quiet divorce in 1946. Babe did not emerge from that failed union as a victim. She emerged sharper, colder, and more deliberate than before. She had thoroughly memorized the intricate, unspoken rules of the high society game. And now, a powerful man holding the entire country in his hands, desperately needed a woman exactly like her to play that game for him. At a towering New York skyscraper, the television king stood frustrated before a locked door. And Babe Paley offered exactly the kind of entry he needed. William S. Paley was not a man accustomed to rejection. He was the man who shaped the thoughts of an entire nation. High above the sleeping city, the massive steel radio tower of the Columbia Broadcasting System blinked with a bright red light. That signal transmitted through the dark American night, carrying voices that millions of people trusted implicitly. Down below, Paley stood with a tightly clenched jaw, his forehead furrowed in deep, silent anger as a clerk aggressively crossed his name off the exclusive guest list of a private, historic Long Island golf club. Paley had personally molded a tiny, struggling radio network into an absolute media monster. He commanded the airwaves and possessed a virtually bottomless fortune. He actively collected expensive modern art, sought profound political influence, and easily acquired the company of beautiful women. He routinely crushed his business rivals with ruthless efficiency in the corporate boardroom. Yet, despite his overwhelming corporate dominance, he found himself repeatedly and humiliatingly blocked at the heavy wooden doors of old money society. The old New York establishment often kept him at a distance, in part because of his Jewish background. He desperately craved the quiet, understated, and highly exclusive recognition of the old aristocracy. He possessed the sheer financial force to buy entire city blocks, but he could not purchase a legitimate invitation to the right drawing rooms. The powerful television king was permanently trapped on the outside, looking in. He urgently needed an entry visa that his massive wealth could never secure. Money could buy reach, but not acceptance. Babe understood the difference instinctively. He needed an ambassador, a pass that no one would dare question. And Babe Paley offered exactly the kind of entry he needed. Watch his ambitious, calculating eyes sharply track her movements across the floor. She walked gracefully through a crowded, formal dinner party overflowing with formidable, deeply entrenched old money patriarchs. He carefully observed the immediate respectful nods from the rigid elite as Babe glided past them without any effort. That specific, silent deference was a distinct privilege that Bill craved to the point of madness. Babe possessed the exact kind of social currency Bill lacked. She carried a pristine historical lineage that commanded instant respect. She exhibited uncopyable aristocratic manners, honed over decades of quiet observation. She maintained effortless social access and a vast network of deep friendships. Her family ties linked her directly to the exact people who rigidly controlled those closed, exclusionary country clubs. Bill Paley did not simply marry Babe because he was utterly mesmerized by her physical beauty. That was merely a convenient, publicly acceptable narrative, not the full truth. He strategically and consciously married a fully functioning elite ecosystem. With Babe at his side, he could move straight into the center of New York society. Few people would dare block his path again. The pattern was clear enough without romance. Babe could move through doors that had stayed closed to him for years, and her presence changed how the old establishment received him. She traded her impeccable name to elevate a media king, while he offered her a massive platform for the social life she had been trained to master. On July 28, 1947, the greatest contract of her life was signed. A sharp, cold fountain pen pressed firmly down, leaving stark black ink across the official marriage certificate. Babe quietly packed her personal belongings into a cardboard box. She methodically put away her magazine drafts, organized her desk, and confidently walked out the revolving glass doors of the Vogue building, completely aware she would never return. Conversely, Babe did not marry Bill solely to acquire a massive, unthinkable fortune. She actively stepped onto an ultimate throne, perfectly completing the rigorous assignment her mother had trained her to accomplish. She left Vogue permanently during the exact same week she was married, abruptly ending her highly successful corporate career. However, she was absolutely not retreating into a quiet, peaceful retirement. She merely transferred her relentless focus to a far more brutal, high-stakes profession. Her new career required infinitely more skill, diplomacy, and absolute control than any editorial position could ever demand. She officially became Mrs. William S. Paley on a full-time, inescapable basis. Every dinner party became a board meeting, and every public appearance functioned as a critical press conference. The structure of her life had been set. Now she had to maintain the world she had entered, no matter what it cost her. But when you spend your life building a world so flawless it becomes unreal, the cost is clear. You are never allowed to stop smiling, even when you are falling apart. Babe possessed a new career with absolutely no recognized office hours. Her workplaces were simply massive estates that constantly consumed her time and vital energy. Open her heavy, leather-bound archive book, and you find detailed dinner menus. Red underlining shows that no guest was ever meant to receive the same meal twice. A piercing, critically assessing glance from Babe rapidly scanned every single crease of the pristine linen napkins before the formal reception officially began. She essentially operated as a high-level corporate manager of absolute visual perfection. She hired the legendary interior designer Billy Baldwin to completely redesign the grand apartment at the St. Regis. She later mandated that Russell Page meticulously reconstruct the entire landscape architecture at the massive Kaluna Farm estate located in Manhasset. Every dinner party was arranged with obsession. Floral displays, seating, and the movement of guests were all tightly controlled. This carefully constructed environment was entirely a fake world. It was visually magnificent to an extent bordering on the surreal. To keep this artificial machine running flawlessly, Babe systematically drained herself. However, even the most impeccably designed house cannot permanently conceal the late, highly problematic footsteps of the powerful man who technically owned it. Tall, razor-sharp azalea hedges provided a heavy visual barrier for a quiet secret garden situated near the private pond. It was the absolute only isolated location where Babe could briefly escape the relentless camera flashes and societal expectations. A dim, lonely light flickered in the massive living room as she sat quietly, waiting for the front door to open in the early hours of the morning. She eventually caught the distinct, lingering scent of cheap perfume clinging tightly to her powerful husband and his very expensive suit vest. Bill Paley fundamentally was never the type of man to remain satisfied with a single beautiful woman, regardless of whether she was widely considered the most perfect woman in America. He was a notorious womanizer who constantly sought a new romantic adventure. He actively trawled numerous crowded bars and highly exclusive private clubs with the explicit intention of finding vibrant blonde models. His constant pursuit of these younger women stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the highly refined elegance his wife carefully maintained. Babe, utilizing the clinical observation skills inherited directly from her physician father, diagnosed the agonizing symptoms of this betrayal with perfect accuracy. She noticed the persistent late returns. She observed the subtle yet unmistakable shifts in his attention, and she felt the profound, freezing marital void that permanently defined their once sacred private bed forever. Faced with that betrayal, Babe made a choice that shaped the rest of her life. She actively chose to remain entirely silent. A bright, completely flawless smile masked her face as she descended the staircase to greet the arriving morning guests, immediately following a night her husband did not return home. Her knuckles turned stark white, gripping the dining table, fiercely suppressing a physical tremor and deep nausea. Babe was not a fragile victim, caught unaware. She was a fully conscious accomplice, actively protecting the grand illusion. She firmly refused to scream. She absolutely refused to break the meticulously maintained performance. She gritted her teeth and kept the estates looking immaculate, the dinner tables lavish, and her public face unblemished. Babe had successfully acquired everything her mother aggressively programmed her to secure. She possessed unlimited financial resources, international fame, and unparalleled social standing. The incredibly cruel reward for achieving absolute social supremacy was her own voluntary confinement. She locked herself inside a beautiful prison. The marriage presented a dazzling facade for the world to admire, but the interior structure was completely frozen and utterly hollow. She maintained that structure the way an editor maintains a page, trimming, arranging, and refusing to let disorder show. When that deception reaches its breaking point, a desperate woman does not always look for escape. Sometimes she only wants someone to share the air with. And somewhere high above the Caribbean Sea, aboard a private jet, that specific breathing room abruptly materialized, carrying both a brilliant laugh and a carefully concealed blade. In the summer of 1955, the clear sky above Jamaica witnessed the beginning of a friendship that would eventually devastate the American elite. The smooth hum of the Paley family private plane engine provided a steady background rhythm. Bill Paley raised his thick eyebrows in a mixture of complete surprise and slight disdain. He quickly realized that the invited guest stepping aboard was not the former President Truman, as he had mistakenly assumed. The unexpected passenger was actually a young, slightly built writer, possessing a very peculiar, high-pitched voice. Truman Capote entered Babe's highly guarded personal space purely by accident, but an invisible, immediate connection was firmly established between them. Inside that incredibly luxurious cabin, Capote instantly shattered the strict formal rules that rigidly governed high society. He made Babe laugh out loud, producing a genuinely radiant, rare smile that no society photographer had ever managed to officially capture. To outside observers, this remarkably mismatched friendship appeared to be incredibly strange and fundamentally illogical. But for Babe, Truman represented a genuine breathing space within a life that was otherwise rigidly controlled. He could be vulgar, funny, quick, and emotionally reckless in ways her world usually punished. That looseness felt like relief. Truman collected the most powerful, beautiful women in America, much like a destitute man, frantically hoarding rare diamonds. At those expensive lunches, the glasses clicked and the room stayed watchful. Women like Slim Keith and CZ Guest measured one another in silence. Capote affectionately referred to his unique group of billionaire female friends as his swans. He viewed them as elegant and powerful goddesses gliding smoothly across a perfectly still lake. Yet, underneath the water's cold surface, their hidden feet were frantically and painfully paddling just to stay afloat. CZ Guest, Gloria Guinness, and the beautiful Marella Agnelli were all considered flawless visual icons. However, within that proud, incredibly wealthy flock, Babe held an absolute, unshakable monopoly. Truman publicly declared to anyone who would listen that Babe was the single most important person in his entire life. The emotional bond between them was incredibly deep, deeply intertwined, and almost obsessive. He explicitly described their profound spiritual connection as being absolutely identical to that of actual passionate lovers. Bill Paley provided Babe with a golden throne and a constant state of internal fear. Truman Capote, however, gave her the rare sensation of being understood beneath the makeup and the ritual of public life. Blind trust often makes betrayal easier. Babe had no reason to believe that lesson would come from him. Over 20 years, Babe turned Truman into the keeper of her private life. She removed her armor around him. She told him secrets she had once planned to take to the grave. She truly believed she had found someone she could trust. She detailed Bill's brazen, continuous infidelities and described the profound humiliation she was forced to swallow in complete silence. She articulated the soul-crushing loneliness that drove her mad inside her massive castles. She exposed the suffocating distance between the broadly smiling woman featured in glossy magazines and the isolated wife crying quietly in the dark. Babe did not merely share gossip with a casual friend. She personally handed over the weakest, most painful corners of her entire life to the one person she trusted completely. She never suspected that her chosen confidant was also collecting material. But a cold law of the literary world existed, one that the proud swans ignored. A true writer never stops listening. Those women, in their arrogance, should have always remembered one fundamental truth. You are never truly safe when you befriend a novelist. Truman possessed cold, constantly shifting eyes, carefully analyzing every detail amidst the loud, echoing laughter. His small hand slipped very quickly into his tailored vest pocket. He pulls out a tiny notebook, hurriedly jotting down the hushed, gossipy whispers floating around the table. Truman Capote was always a writer first. His ambition for literary immortality overshadowed any personal loyalty. His sharp ears never truly clocked off duty. His notorious notebook never completely closed. For years, he had been loudly promising a monumental project called Answered Prayers. He arrogantly believed this upcoming work would stand as his ultimate masterpiece. He intended it to be an unflinching, brutally honest portrait, stripping away the rotting, luxurious facade of high American society. The warning signs of a massive betrayal had always been hovering right in front of them. The oldest rule of literature states that a writer invariably uses what he intimately knows. But after sharing 20 years of close, intimate friendship, Babe and the other swans were completely lulled into a deep, false security. They entirely forgot the basic nature of the man sitting across from them. They were not simply sharing vulnerable secrets with a trusted confidant. They were pouring their darkest tragedies directly into a massive vacuum cleaner. Truman was actively collecting their deep pain to use as the raw material for his own social advancement. And the illusion of safety, of untouchable power, reached its absolute zenith on a foggy night in November 1966. The blinding, radiant light of massive crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Intricate, elaborately feathered masks carefully hid the faces of the most powerful people on the planet. Elegant bodies spun gracefully across the polished dance floor in a dizzying, beautiful display of staggering wealth. Capote spared absolutely no expense to host the legendary black and white ball. The press quickly treated the gathering as the party of the century. Its guest list, drawn from the most visible names in society, became a public measure of status. If your specific name was missing from that exclusive paper, you simply did not exist. Princess Lee Radziwill, Lauren Bacall, Frank Sinatra, and Katharine Graham were all present in the crowded room. Babe Paley arrived, looking spectacularly radiant and undeniably regal. The Paley family had even utilized their massive social influence to host an exclusive pre-ball dinner to actively elevate their diminutive friend. This evening represented the insurmountable peak of high glamour, hard money, and carefully constructed artificial masks. The celebrated ball was not just a place to dance and drink very expensive champagne. It marked the exact historical moment Truman was officially accepted by the heavily guarded old aristocracy. He had finally reached the undisputed center of global power. He stood proudly at the top of the very world that had previously shunned his existence. But the elite crowd actively celebrating him completely failed to understand his true, calculating perspective. He was not just enjoying their lavish, unprecedented hospitality. He was quietly observing the fatal structural weaknesses of the glittering golden cage they all inhabited. But right at the exact epicenter of that ultimate glory, an invisible blade had been secretly sharpened to a razor edge. Truman offered an arrogant, deeply mysterious smile as he gently clinked an expensive glass of champagne with Babe. His sharp eyes pierced directly through the glittering masks of the swans, staring straight into the dark, desperate, and agonizing voids hidden inside their souls. A terrifying, unseen contrast defined that historic evening. While Babe proudly watched her closest confidant finally conquer high society, Capote was actively bleeding their fragile spirits dry. The cold, ruthless process of writing was already well underway. The proud, untouchable swans smiling and toasting his massive success were already pinned like dead insects across his unfinished manuscript pages. He stood victorious on the highest summit of the exact society that had fed and sheltered him. Yet, he simultaneously plotted to publicly betray every single person who had granted him a golden visa into that exclusive room. He was casually drinking their vintage wine while finalizing the brutal blueprints for their ultimate social destruction. By then, the betrayal was already in motion, and for Babe, it would arrive alongside a devastating medical sentence. 8 years after that glorious, hallucinatory night, the silk masks would be forced to drop permanently. This sudden collapse made way for cold hospital machinery and a disease that spares no one, no matter how perfect they are. In 1974, at the age of 58, the completely flawless machine known as Babe Paley officially received a devastating medical sentence. Look closely at the brittle, severely damaged strands of hair clinging heavily to a pristine white pillowcase following rounds of highly aggressive chemotherapy. Her incredibly thin hands visibly trembled, her blue veins sharply prominent against her pale skin. Yet, she maintained absolute physical control as she firmly, decisively wrapped a vibrant silk turban tightly around her skull, effectively concealing the brutal physical deterioration of her body. After decades of smoking 2 packs a day to manage her anxiety, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. The prescribed medical treatment ruthlessly destroyed her legendary physical beauty. But the most profound element of her tragedy was her absolute refusal to utilize this severe illness as an acceptable excuse to finally abandon her exhausting lifelong performance. She aggressively transformed her tragic hair loss into a globally recognized symbol of supreme high fashion. The vibrant silk turbans designed specifically to hide her impending death quickly sparked a massive fashion trend copied by women everywhere. The society around her would only tolerate visible illness if it was wrapped in silk and managed with perfect composure. She understood that rule and obeyed it, even while treatment stripped away the body that had helped build her public legend. As one sharp observer accurately noted, she had essentially transformed the grim process of dying into a highly coveted fashion accessory. However, the agonizing disease destroying her physical body from the inside could not compare to the devastating psychological blow delivered forcefully from behind. Listen to the harsh, tearing sound of crisp pages turning in a brand new, ink-smelling copy of Esquire magazine. The black text laid out the sexual life of a character named Sidney Dillon. The details were specific enough that New York recognized the target immediately. Facing immense financial pressure and strict deadlines from his publisher, Truman Capote deliberately chose to sell an advance chapter of his unfinished novel to the national magazine. The excerpt, titled La Côte Basque, 1965, specifically utilized the actual New York restaurant as its central setting. Truman changed the names and claimed the characters were composites. The New York elite recognized the material instantly. The wealthy character of Sidney Dillon was widely recognized as a stand-in for Bill Paley. The incredibly graphic details regarding his infidelity, the resulting deep humiliation of his wife, and the inclusion of highly sensitive private marriage knowledge shocked the elite reading public. Babe was horrified to discover that the wounds she had shared in confidence were now printed as entertainment. This was not a minor piece of exaggerated society gossip. This was the deliberate, incredibly cruel exploitation of her deepest personal agony, mass-produced and distributed for a massive national audience. The first horrific, bloody warning sign did not originate from Babe's own immediate reaction, but from the sudden, deeply shocking death of another prominent woman. Imagine the frantic, piercing rings of telephone dials echoing urgently across the wealthy apartments of the Upper East Side. A discarded bottle of heavy barbiturates rolled slowly across a cold floor, coming to rest near the completely motionless pale body of Anne Woodward. Rumors spread that Anne Woodward had learned how Capote used her story. Soon after, she died from an overdose, and the fear among the Swans deepened. Slim Keith frantically dialed Babe's private number in a state of absolute shock, while CZ Guest simultaneously attempted to reach Slim. This represented the terrifying, ultimate moment of brutal clarity when the proud swans finally understood their true position. They were no longer genuine friends existing in Truman Capote's actual life. They had been officially demoted, entirely transformed into heavily exploited, expendable characters sacrificed upon his literary chessboard. Now that the first treacherous arrow had successfully claimed a life, the second, poisoned arrow was flying straight toward a woman already battling a terminal disease. When the privileged world around her panicked and fractured, the most perfect woman in New York executed a silent response that froze her enemies completely. In November 1975, the toxic chemicals of chemotherapy were actively draining the reserves of her physical strength. She sat with trembling hands and opened the latest issue of Esquire magazine. Her vacant, unfocused eyes scanned the crisp black text printed across the page. She read a single sentence, and then she recognized another deeply familiar detail. Those specific, highly intimate descriptions could not possibly originate from a writer's active imagination. They were stolen directly from her own tears over 20 long, agonizing years. The carefully maintained image she fiercely protected was sliced open for public consumption. The man she trusted most delivered the fatal wound precisely when her body was failing completely. She slowly picked up the telephone to call Slim Keith. Her thin, incredibly bitter voice stuck to the receiver as she asked if her friend had seen the new publication. A heavy, helpless sigh sounded from the other end of the telephone line. Slim delivered the chilling news regarding the sudden loss of life of Anne Woodward. Hearing that the devastating article had already claimed a vulnerable victim, Babe did not scream or display violent anger. She simply responded with a faint, utterly resigned tone. She whispered quietly that she wanted to die too. That brief statement carried a terrifying emotional weight. The writer did not end her life, but he helped break what remained of her will to survive. The publication essentially weaponized her private agony. The deepest secrets she shared in the shadowed corners of her garden were now mass-produced entertainment. She realized her trusted confidant was merely a patient observer gathering profitable material. The ultimate betrayal completely severed her remaining ties to the outside world, leaving her to face the final, darkest chapter of her existence entirely alone. Backed into a corner, the perfect woman deployed the most brutal weapon she still possessed. The telephone rang incessantly with desperate calls from Truman Capote, but the shrill noise was cut off with absolute, unconditional finality. Her ice-cold, completely undisturbed eyes glided past the massive Picasso painting hanging on her apartment wall. Meanwhile, the dark silhouette of Bill Paley rushed hurriedly past his wife's room without pausing to check on her rapidly deteriorating condition. After absorbing that calculated strike, Babe never uttered another single syllable to Truman Capote again. Not one day, not 1 week, absolutely zero leniency was granted throughout the final 3 years of her life. Capote frantically attempted to reach her, utilizing his famous charm to offer cheap justifications for his destructive actions. He repeatedly asked his peers what the women expected, stating that he was simply doing his job as a writer. That hollow, pathetic defense meant absolutely nothing to her. She delivered the most devastating punishment possible by erasing his existence entirely from her isolated, silent universe. Regarding Bill Paley, He had also read the magazine and clearly recognized his own reflection in the scandalous text. However, Babe had expended 30 grueling years actively refusing to interrogate her husband's endless affairs. She firmly decided against initiating that exhausting war while standing on the precipice of her own grave. Hidden beneath her stylish turban, Babe was tortured by a bone-chilling, inescapable fear. She quietly suspected that she had never been truly loved by anyone. She sacrificed her beautiful youth and endured silence for a husband who primarily utilized her as a decorative asset. She surrendered her vulnerabilities to a soulmate who ultimately sold her for literary prestige. An entire world deeply admired her flawless public image, yet absolutely no one understood her internal desolation. That proud woman refused visible weakness. She decided to direct the final details of her own passing with exacting control. Her bony hands carefully formed flawless cursive letters, writing strict instructions filed neatly into a heavy folder. Small, exquisite jewelry boxes were meticulously wrapped in delicate tissue paper, each bearing a specific name tag designating the intended recipient. On July 6, 1978, Babe Paley died, just one day after turning 63. Right up until the final moment, the entire operation ran as smoothly as a well-oiled machine. Every valuable parcel was properly assigned, the exclusive funeral guest list was finalized, and even the exact vintage of expensive wine to be served was clearly mandated. Per her absolute, irrevocable decree, Truman Capote was permanently banned from attending the somber memorial service. Bill Paley wept loudly during the funeral proceedings, yet he lived comfortably until 1990, retaining control of a massive estate valued at $500 million. In death, Bill Paley was buried beside her. It was a closeness he had largely avoided in life. All the magnificent theatrical sets Babe drained her lifeblood to construct eventually faded away. The quiet secret garden and the sprawling, luxurious architecture of Kaluna Farm were later demolished and completely flattened by heavy bulldozers. Unflinching perfection ultimately proved to be mortal. The unparalleled styling could not salvage a spirit that had been systematically hollowed out. She left behind a priceless wardrobe and a towering media empire, but she took a sharp, permanently unanswered question into the dark earth. When the cold ashes of extreme luxury finally cover everything, the naked truth regarding the terrible price of beauty and absolute power is completely exposed. She spent her entire life turning everything she touched into a flawless work of art. Lifeless, perfectly bowed jewelry boxes lie cold and heavy across the large, empty bed on Fifth Avenue. A gilded clock ticks endlessly, marking the silent, soulless rhythm of the vast room. America proudly celebrated Babe Paley as the ultimate, undeniable perfect woman. That title was certainly not a compliment. It was a ruthless, inescapable life sentence. She realized far too late that no magnificent beauty could ever shield her from those two men who always knew exactly where to strike to hurt her the most.